This is lecture number 7 on the Renaissance for Theory of Architecture, Architecture 322.92. This is a statue of Filippo Brunelleschi, the great architect of the early Renaissance. There he is. He's standing on the right there with his friends, the painters Masaccio and Masolino. This is a detail of a fresco by Masaccio in the Patsy Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine in Florence. This is a close group of people who created the Renaissance in Florence. Brunelleschi was trained as a goldsmith. He lost the competition for the doors of the Florence Baptistry on the lower left there to Lorenzo Ghiberti. So he went to Rome for 14 years, studied the architecture, returned to Florence, and built the dome on the new cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore. The cathedral was designed by Arnolfo di Cambio. He built an octagonal drum, but couldn't figure out how to engineer a dome for it. Nobody else could for 100 years. The tower there was designed by the painter Giotto. Finally, Brunelleschi conceived of a double shell dome that distributed the load of the dome, and it was able to be built on such a large drum. He learned that lesson from studying the Pantheon in Rome with its double shell walls and the trellis between the walls that distribute the load. The same thing here, there's a trellis between the two shells of the dome that distributes the load. When the new cathedral was constructed, the old cathedral, San Lorenzo, dedicated to the patron saint of Rome, was converted into the parish church for the Medici family, and Brunelleschi was hired to do the new architecture for that. He never designed a facade, so there's no facade, no marble facade on the church. He did design a new nave, though, in around 1422. So this is Brunelleschi's new nave for the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. The gray stone is Pietra Serena. It's based on the architecture of the early Christian basilica in Rome, which Brunelleschi studied, like Santa Sabina. He thought he was studying Roman basilicas, but he wasn't. So he placed arches on columns, which does not exist in a Roman basilica, but does exist in an early Christian basilica. There are impost blocks between the column capitals and the arches to raise the arches up to align them with the arches on the outer aisles. The aisles are lined with chapels. This is the first time chapels appear in a church. They were, the Medici subsidized the construction by allowing other families in Florence to have chapels in the church that they paid for. The tabularium motif is placed on the outside of the chapels. There's a flat wooden coffered dome, C-O-F-F-E-R-E-D. In order to lay this out, Brunelleschi used a new invention of his, a mathematically based perspective construction called the costruzione legittima, or legitimate construction, a term coined by Erwin Panofsky, the art historian. Perspective construction can be seen in paintings, fragments from the classical world in Pompeii throughout the Middle Ages, but it isn't mathematically based. So Brunelleschi invented a system using the horizon line, vanishing point, and receding lines with a mathematically measured grid superimposed on it, so that the entire space is held together by mathematics. This was brand new. It had never been seen before, and it's the great invention of the Italian Renaissance. Brunelleschi didn't write this down for some reason. He was fluent in Latin, but it was first written down by Leon Battista Alberti in the treatise De Pictura in 1435. So in the nave of the church, the altar corresponds to the vanishing point. The transept corresponds to the horizon line, and the colonnades and arcades correspond to the receding lines to the vanishing point. So it works perfectly for the church. It's pretty clear that the Costruzione Legittima isn't just a technical procedure, it's also a catechism of Catholic theology. In the church, the altar is the site of the Eucharist and the transubstantiation, the miracle of the transformation of the body and blood of Christ to the bread and the wine, which you consume in the Eucharist. So it's the liminal point or the threshold between the physical and material world. In classical philosophy, the point is the closest thing to the spiritual world and the physical world. So the perspective construction is a catechism for the geometrical unfolding of the matter of the material world from the infinite or unlimited or spiritual, similar to the pyramid in Egypt, where the multiplicity proceeds from the unity and the matter proceeds from the light, representing the threshold between the physical and the spiritual worlds. Brunelleschi also used a module to design the nave at San Lorenzo, which was revived from ancient Roman practice. The module is one dimension, which is multiplied in every other dimension. So it could be the radius of a column or the diameter of a doorknob or something, a minor dimension that is repeated in every other dimension as a multiple of the module. The Romans did this. It was not done in the Middle Ages. Brunelleschi revived it, and it became a stock part of Renaissance architecture. In the Renaissance, the system of measurement based on the braccia, which means arm, was based on the proportions of the human body, just like in the classical world. This was abandoned soon after the Renaissance. We now use systems that have no relationship to the human body. So the Renaissance building relates to the body in a way that modern buildings do not. The module ensures, it makes it easier to construct the building, and it ensures an aesthetic harmony in the building. A good example of the perspective construction as a catechism for the threshold between the spiritual and the physical is the courtyard at the complex at La Jolla, California, the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn. Here it looks like an abstract version of the nave of the church, with the central aisle, the side aisles, chapels, horizon line, and vanishing point corresponding to nature, and the threshold between the finite and the infinite, or the physical and the spiritual, that was introduced by Brunelleschi in the nave at San Lorenzo. That's Santa Sabina, a basilica, a Christian basilica in Rome that Brunelleschi studied. Arches are placed on columns. This contradicts the principles of classical architecture. It doesn't exist in any classical building. It was introduced in the early Christian basilicas, probably to contradict pagan architecture, because Christianity is monotheistic. Brunelleschi thought that this was a Roman basilica, but he was mistaken. Also has a flat coffered wooden ceiling. The first application of the new Costruzione Legittima in painting is the fresco called the Trinity by Masaccio in Santa Maria Novella in Florence in 1428. The vanishing point is at the body of Christ. God is above him. The dove is the Spirit. The red, white, and blue also symbolize the Trinity. The red for the blood of Christ, the white for the Spirit, the blue for God. The figures with John the Evangelist and the Virgin Mary below are framed in the architecture of Brunelleschi, with the arch on the column the coffered Roman barrel vault, the fluted pilasters off to the sides, the donors off to the sides, and then the grisaille trompe-l'oeil coffin or sarcophagus down below with the skeleton and the inscription in Latin, which translated says, "I am what you will become, and you are what I once was." The first application of the costruzione legittima to sculpture is the so-called Gates of Paradise by Lorenzo Ghiberti, his second set of doors on the Florence baptistry in 1425. So he uses the mathematically based perspective construction to create the illusion of a real space receding into the distance, and he pulls the figures out rounded in full dimensions to emphasize the spatial recession. There's a self-portrait of Lorenzo Ghiberti, which he places at the corner of every panel in the Gates of Paradise. They were given that nickname by Michelangelo. Brunelleschi also designed the old sacristy in San Lorenzo, begun in 1418. The new sacristy was designed later by Michelangelo to the right of the altar. This is to the left of the altar. It contains the tomb of Giovanni de Medici, the patriarch of the Medici family. It's a perfect circle and spherical dome placed on top of a perfect cube. It's a pendentive dome. The pendentives are the spaces between the arches and the cornice of the dome, the lower rung of the dome. The pendentives have the coat of arms of the Medici family with the red pallae, or balls, which are both cannonballs and oranges, symbolizing the military strength of the family and also its humanistic aspirations. Reliefs of the four evangelists are under the arches by Brunelleschi's friend Donatello. So the pendentive dome is the circle and the square in plan. So it's the same thing as the drawing of the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. The circle is heaven, the square is earth. So the sacristy is where the liturgical instruments and vestments are kept in a church. The sacristy also acts as a martyrium, accommodating the ascension of the soul of the martyr to heaven from the square earth to the circular dome. In the dome, on the top there's an oculus in the center and 12 ribs connecting the oculus to the cornice. The oculus represents the sun. The 12 ribs represent both the zodiac and the apostles, synthesizing pagan mythology and Catholic theology. So it's a catechism of the creation of matter from light and the creation of multiplicity from unity, just like the pyramids in Egypt. So the pendentives represent the connection between the spiritual world and the physical world. Usually the images of the evangelists are in the pendentives. Here they're under the arches and between the pendentives, because the evangelists also represent the connection between God and the physical world, because they put the ideas of God into the word or the logos. The dome below is the dome of the altar of the sacristy. It's also a pendentive dome. The shells on the pendentive symbolize Christ, and in the dome is painted a horoscope, the first horoscope of the Renaissance of the Medici family. So again, it combines pagan mythology and Catholic theology. The horoscope was designed by Paolo Toscanelli. Paolo Toscanelli was the most important mathematician and cartographer of the Renaissance. He was part of the court of the humanist Pope Nicholas V, Tommaso Parentucelli. He was a friend of Cristoforo Colombo. It was Toscanelli who figured out that if you sailed west in the ocean, you would run into another continent. So he convinced Christopher Columbus of this, and Columbus convinced Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain to fund him on the project. They discovered a new continent, and they named it after their mutual friend, Americo Vespucci, another explorer in Florence. There's a painting by Giorgio Vasari in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. There's Cosimo de Medici in the center, and that's Paolo Toscanelli on the right, holding a book. Brunelleschi also designed the Patsy Chapel at Santa Croce in Florence, using the same vocabulary as the old sacristy at San Lorenzo. Here, the images of the evangelists are in the pendentives. Below them is the Patsy coat of arms, the same dome with the oculus for the sun and the ribs for the rays of light, and then the cube down below for the material world. This is Leon Battista Alberti, the next great architect of the Renaissance. Alberti was born in Florence, but his family was enemies with the Medici, so he was exiled from Florence, grew up in Genoa. He put himself through college and law school in Bologna, got a job working as secretary to the Pope Nicholas V in Rome, the great humanist pope who assembled a court of great scholars around him. Alberti's goal in life was to regain the social status that had been lost to his family by being exiled from Florence, and he was able to do that by writing treatises based on conversations he had with members of the court of Nicholas V in Rome. So he wrote treatises on painting, architecture, family, ethics, music, things like that, none of which he had any training in or had studied. But by doing this, he became very famous and was very successful in regaining his family's status in Florence. It's a pretty amazing accomplishment. This is a painting believed to be of Alberti. It's believed to be by Masaccio, and it's in the Gardner Museum in Boston, just behind the Museum of Fine Arts. So Alberti, in conversations with Brunelleschi, published a treatise on painting in 1435 called De Pictura, in which he described the costruzione legittima, the mathematically based perspective construction, how the painter can lay out the mathematical grid to create the illusion of the reality of spatial recession. Of course, there is no vanishing point or horizon line or mathematical grid in the nature that we perceive. This is all invented by the human mind. So it tells us that what we perceive is already constructed by us in our mind, and it corresponds with a mathematical grid that we construct, which is why Renaissance painting looks so much more realistic than anything before it. This is the treatise on architecture, published in 1450. It's called De Re Edificatoria, or On Things Built. It's divided into 10 books, modeled after the treatise by Vitruvius from the 1st century BC in Rome. This is the first treatise on architecture written since Vitruvius, a good 1500 years prior. The key concepts, if you read the treatise, most of it's pretty boring, just like the treatise by Vitruvius talks about the weather and the climate and the soil and materials and things like that. But there are a few interesting sections on aesthetics, and the key terms in these sections on aesthetics in Alberti's treatise are continuitas, lineament, and syncretism. Alberti says that architecture consists of two things, lineament and matter. The matter is the material of the building. The lineament is the line in the mind of the architect. A building is a work of architecture if lines are applied by an architect and perceived by an individual, or conceived or thought by an individual as an intelligible, an object of the nous poeticos, beyond the material presence of the building. Continuitas is the Latin word for beauty. Alberti defines it in a slightly unique way. He says that continuitas is the whole that exceeds the sum of the parts. So that's Alberti's definition of beauty. If you're an architect, your goal should be, according to Alberti, to create a composition that has a lot of different parts combined together that are seemingly unrelated. That kind of competition is called a syncretic composition. So that's where syncretism comes in. You want to do that because you want to create a historical sort of treatise in your architecture. You want your architecture to be a culmination of past historical developments to represent your culture as the most developed culture of all time. So you combine all these references to history, all these unrelating parts in a syncretic composition, and your goal as the architect is to tie them all together so that they have a beauty and a harmony that creates a whole that exceeds just the sum of the individual parts. So you're kind of like a bumblebee collecting pieces of pollen and making honey out of it. How does nature do that? That's the goal of the architect. The way that the architect does that, the way that the architect achieves the concinitas is through the use of the lineament, the underlying mathematical proportions and geometrical lines and relationships that the architect applies to the architecture. So a good example of this is Alberti's first commission as an architect, resulting from his fame from writing his treatise on architecture. He became the leading authority on classical architecture in Italy. He was hired by the Rucellai family in Florence to build a new facade for their palazzo. The Rucellai were also enemies of the Medici, so they were friends with the Alberti family. They actually hosted meetings in the courtyard of their palace where people conspired against the Medici family. One of the people there was Niccolo Machiavelli, who was arrested after one of the meetings and imprisoned and then sent into exile. The Palazzo Rucellai, currently the descendants of the Rucellai family live on the top level, which is called the mezzanine level. Currently, the first level, which is called the pian terreno or ground level, has stores in it, and the first floor, which we would call the second floor, but in Europe it's the first floor, above the ground level, is the piano nobile or noble floor, and that currently is rented by the Institute for Fine and Liberal Arts, which hosts as classrooms for students, international students, including Roger Williams students. So Roger Williams students who have been to Florence may have taken classes in the Palazzo Rucellai. There's a bench down at the bottom called the banco, where business transactions took place in the Renaissance. That's where the word bank comes from. So the composition of the facade features the three levels, the pian terreno, the piano nobile, and the mezzanine level. That's typical of a palazzo in Florence. That's the typical Florentine palazzo. But Alberti mixes into that the columns, or pilasters, the flattened columns on the wall, which mimic the columns on the Colosseum in Rome in the order from below to above, the Doric order on the ground level, the pian terreno, the Ionic order on the piano nobile, and the Corinthian order on the mezzanine level. And then he inserts arches between the pilasters to reproduce the tabularium motif. So he's got a mixture, a syncretic composition with all kinds of different references to both Roman architecture and Florentine architecture. So it's a kind of historical composition, something that's never seen before. It's similar to what the Romans did in their architecture, which was quite syncretic. So this is revived by Alberti to introduce a new kind of architecture, which became very influential because it coincided with the invention of the printing press. And so architects in the next generation had books with images, and so they could easily incorporate different references into their architecture to create a syncretic composition. So how does Alberti pull all of these different pieces together in order to create concinitas? he uses mathematical and geometrical proportions. There are three sizes of bays, and their proportions correspond to the Pythagorean harmonies. So the Pythagorean harmonies play a big role in the lineament to create the congenitas. Alberti believed that if you use the Pythagorean harmonies, the building would have a harmony, the architecture would have a harmony similar to that of music, because the Pythagorean harmonies, the ratios of 2 to 1, 3 to 2, and 4 to 3, correspond to the octave, the fifth, and the fourth in music. So the Palazzo Rucellai is a good example of the use of the lineament, the harmonic proportions, and the geometrical ratios to achieve the congenitas by pulling all of the pieces together in the syncretic composition. Just like Alberti believed a painting should tell a story, an historia, he believed that a building should tell a story. There's the Colosseum in Rome, the Flavian Amphitheater, with the orders Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and the composite on the top there going up from the ground. Also the tabulary motif. Alberti spent a lot of time in Rome, so he's very familiar with this building. There's the Banco in front of the Palazzo Rucellai. The diagonal lines are a reference to the opus reticulatum from Roman brickwork, the diagonal grout joints. There's an illustration of this in Alberti's treatise on architecture, De Re Edificatoria. There's Niccolo Machiavelli, who was arrested after a meeting in the courtyard of the Palazzo Rucellai. He was imprisoned in the Bargello, sent into exile, where he wrote the famous book called The Prince, which was a critique of the politics of the Medici family, which were basically a mafia-style government. Last time I was in Florence, I think, was in 2003. I co-organized a conference with my friend Liana de Girolami-Ceni, Neoplatonic Aesthetics, Music, Literature, and the Visual Arts. My paper was on this very subject, describing how Alberti used the Pythagorean harmonies in the proportions of the facade of the Palazzo Rucellai, which is actually something I discovered, so that's my contribution to scholarship on Alberti. We published a book of the same name with the illustration of the Palazzo Rucellai on the cover. Another good example of Alberti's series is his facade for the Church of Santa Maria Novella, just down the street, in the Palazzo degli Stranieri. He adds a marble facade to an existing medieval wooden basilica. This was also commissioned by Giovanni Rucellai. Here he has all kinds of different references to historical architecture. There's a pediment on top from a classical Greek temple. There's a rose window from the Gothic cathedral. There's a blind arcade from the Romanesque church. There's striped voussoir arches from the mosque. There's a Byzantine mosaic, etc., etc. All kinds of things combined. They all fit into a perfect square. They're all subdivided by perfect Platonic geometries, and they're all proportioned according to proportioning systems like the golden ratio and the Pythagorean harmonies. So Alberti achieves his syncretism and his congenitas through the use of the lineament at the Santa Maria Novella. And this is the Trinity Fresco by Masaccio is inside there. The sun in the pediment is a reference to pagan mythology. There's no connection between God and the sun in the Christian Bible. The scrolls on either side are the only modern part of the building, Alberti adds, a device he invents to connect the upper side aisle, or the upper nave, high upper nave with the lower side aisles. It's a combination of the green marble, the Prato marble, and the white marble, the Luni marble, which is very common in Florence. It symbolizes the city of Florence. The sailboat along the entablature is a symbol of the Rucellai family. There's a diagram showing how the facade can be broken down into the geometrical parts that ensure the congenitas, the harmony of the whole that exceeds the sum of the parts through the lineament. Here's a detail of a fresco in the same church, Santa Maria Novella, by the painter Ghirlandaio. There's Marsilio Ficino in the center there with the gray hair. There's Cristoforo Landino to his left, the great poet. Angelo Poliziano, second from the right, is a tutor to the children of the Medici family. Marsilio Ficino was the most important philosopher of the Renaissance. There's a painting by, I think it's by Vasari in the Palazzo Vecchio. There's Lorenzo de Medici in the center. There's Marsilio Ficino just to his right, then Cristoforo Landino. On the other side of the painting, to the left of Lorenzo de Medici, the guy with the red hat and the long hair is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, the most famous student of Ficino. So Ficino was the unofficial director of the Platonic Academy, assembled in Florence. The Medici family, especially Lorenzo de Medici, were great patrons of the arts. They spent a lot of money hiring people like Michelangelo and Donatello and Brunelleschi to do the artwork for them. And they spent a lot of money to allow the scholars to translate the works of classical philosophy, especially Plato, which is what Ficino was primarily occupied with. Plato was untranslated before the Renaissance, except for the Timaeus, and so Marsilio Ficino is responsible for translating every work of Plato for the first time from Greek into Latin and making Plato available to Europe and the Western world. So it's a pretty huge accomplishment. He also wrote original treatises on philosophy. He wrote a book called the Theologia Platonica, or the Platonic Theology, synthesizing Plato with Catholic theology. He wrote a book called De Amore, a commentary on the Symposium of Plato. He coined the term Platonic love in the De Amore. He was also bishop of the Cathedral of Florence, so he had very high standing in Florentine society. His father was a physician for the Medici family, and so Ficino was in a favored position for the Medici family. So here's Lorenzo de Medici gathering with the writers and the artists and sharing their ideas and discussing Platonic philosophy in this Platonic Academy, which wasn't really an academy, just an unofficial gathering of scholars working for the Medici family. The Medici family did give them one of their villas to use, the Villa Careggi. The Medici owned 7 villas on the outskirts of Florence. This one's in the northern suburbs. It's part of a hospital complex now. So the scholars and artists met here in meetings for the Platonic Academy. The Platonic Academy was founded by a Byzantine scholar named George Gemistus Pleton. People who attended the meetings included Leon Battista Alberti. Alberti and Ficino were good friends, although Alberti was much older than Ficino. But Alberti would stay at Ficino's house when he visited Florence from Rome. Cristoforo Landino, Angelo Poliziano, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola are some of the other important scholars there. There's Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. He wrote a treatise called Oration on the Dignity of Man, one of the core treatises of Renaissance humanism. In it, he says that man is special because only the human being can connect to God and earth. Only the human soul can ascend to the spiritual world and descend into the physical world. So because of that, the human being should be put on a pedestal because the human being is necessary for an understanding of God and the earth created by God. So this is one of the basic ideas of Renaissance humanism. It's best illustrated in the drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. The man connects heaven and earth, heaven being the circle and earth being the square. Man is the measure of all things. Man is a microcosm of the cosmos. These are the basic ideas of Renaissance humanism that were revived from the classical world, explained by Pico della Mirandola in his treatise Oration on the Dignity of Man, and expressed in the art and architecture through the syncretism, the lineament, the congenitas, as described by Alberti, and as displayed in the drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. He uses the golden ratio here. This is a famous painting by Botticelli, Alessandro Botticelli. It's in the Ogni Santi Church on the Arno in Florence. It shows St. Augustine, one of the doctors of the Catholic Church, contemplating an armillary sphere, a model of the orbits of the planets, although we know now that planets didn't orbit in circles. So this symbolizes the interest in the church in pagan philosophy and science. So the synthesis of the pagan and the Christian, and the synthesis between the scientific knowledge and Catholic faith. Another painting by Botticelli is The Birth of Venus, famous icon of the Renaissance in the Uffizi in Florence. The subject of this was dictated by Marsilio Ficino. It's a story from the Metamorphoses of Ovid. Venus is born. Venus is the goddess of love and beauty. She is born from foam that appears in the water. The foam arrives there when Kronos, who is the Saturn in Rome, he's the son of Zeus and Gaia, the goddess of the earth, or not Zeus, Uranos, the goddess of the sky. Uranos and Gaia are having sex. Gaia is unhappy that she has to have sex all the time with her husband, so she complains about it to her son Kronos. So Kronos takes a knife and lops off his father's genitalia, throws them in the ocean, and the foam forms around the castrated genitalia. Venus is born from them, and she is blown to shore by Zephyr, the god of the wind, standing on a shell. Zephyr is accompanied by Chloris, the wood nymph, and Venus is greeted by Flora, who symbolizes Florence. She's wearing Florentine costume. Florence is named for Flora, the goddess of flowers, the Roman Pomona. This story from pagan Greek mythology is an allegory for the Platonic idea of love and beauty. There are two kinds of beauty. There's physical beauty and there's the idea of beauty. There are two kinds of love. There's physical love and the idea of love. So the goddess of beauty, being born from the castrated genitalia, symbolizes a love and beauty that have no connection to the physical. So that's a pretty clear indication that the connection to the physical has been severed, and so you have a purely Platonic or ideal or archetypal love and beauty. So it's all Platonic philosophy, which was being discussed at the Platonic Academy in the Villa Correggi at Florence. The figure of Venus is in the Venus Pudica pose from classical sculpture. The face of Venus is a portrait of Simonetta Vespucci, the muse of the artists in Florence in the Renaissance. She was the niece of Americo Vespucci, who Americo was named after. He was friends with Paolo Toscanelli and Cristoforo Colombo. So this is an icon of the Renaissance because it explains what the Renaissance artists were attempting to do in their artwork. It is influenced by this revolution in knowledge with the first ever translations into Latin of the works of Plato. Where Renaissance means rebirth, it's a rebirth of classical knowledge. Aristotle was known throughout the Middle Ages, Plato was not. So it's really mostly a rebirth of the knowledge of Plato, which Plato's manuscripts came into Florence following the economic and military downfall of the Byzantine Empire in the East, and the economic recovery of Europe. All of this paid for by the Medici family. So my friend Liana de Girolami Cheney and I had another conference in Rome in 2000, before the Florence conference. It met at the American University of Rome, just across from the American Academy. And here's the poster for that, Neoplatonism and the Arts in Italy. It became clear to me that there's no work of art produced in the Renaissance or anywhere between the beginning of the Middle Ages and the end of the Renaissance that wasn't influenced by Neoplatonism. In the Renaissance, Neoplatonism is the synthesis of Plato and Catholic theology. In the Middle Ages, Neoplatonism involves a synthesis of Plato with Aristotle and the Peripatetics and other philosophical systems. So this is a poster for the conference in Rome with the picture of Simonetta Vespucci from the birth of Botticelli's Birth of Venus on it. And there's a book from that conference also with the picture of Simonetta Vespucci. Another famous painting that applies the Costruzione Legittima and the Lineament is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. So the perspective corresponds to Christ, the vanishing point, and then you can see the receding lines corresponding to the doors or whatever they are on either side. It actually continues the lines of the room, the refectory at Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. So it looks like the room is continuing off in the distance there. So the table corresponds to the horizon line. The red, white, blue symbolizes the Trinity. And then everything is arranged in mathematical proportions. You have the 3 windows at the center symbolizing the Trinity, the 4 windows on either side symbolizing the quadrivium, the material world, like the trivium and quadrivium in the Middle Ages. Then you have the apostles are divided up into 4 groups of 3, reinforcing that numerical division. And the bread on the table is also arranged in numerical proportions. So here Leonardo uses a number of devices in the lineament of the painting in combination with the Costruzione Legittima in order to create a concinitas, which is what the Renaissance is known for. So this is San Lorenzo. So the nave is on the lower right there, Brunelleschi's nave. There was no marble facade ever built on it. The large dome in back is the Chapel of the Princes from later on. The small dome in front of that is the dome of the old sacristy by Brunelleschi. The dome to the right of the nave is the new sacristy by Michelangelo. There's a courtyard in the foreground with an orange tree in it, which is a symbol of the Medici family. There's a member of the Medici family in their courtyard, surrounded, I guess that's Lorenzo de Medici, surrounded by artists and scholars. There's Michelangelo on the right, presenting a bust of a faun to Leonardo. The bust of the faun is a copy of a Greek and a Roman antique bust. Artists like Michelangelo made a lot of money creating copies of antique busts and passing them off as the original antique work of art, making a lot of money doing that. So Michelangelo was taken in by the Medici family at an early age. His childhood friends grew up to be popes, Pope Leo X, and what's the other guy, Pope's name? I forget now. Leo X anyway. And so they hired Michelangelo to build a new library at San Lorenzo, along with the new sacristy. The Laurentian Library, as it's called, or the Library of San Lorenzo, features the Pietra Serena, the serene stone, in a pretty radical-looking staircase that looks like lava flowing down. So Michelangelo animates or anthropomorphizes the sculpture. And then in the treatment of the wall, he breaks a lot of the rules of classical architecture. He inserts the columns inside the wall. He hangs scrolls down from the columns. He puts columns upside down. He tapers the columns. He does all kinds of weird things that purposely contradict. He's using the vocabulary of classical architecture, but he's purposely contradicting it. This is called mannerism in architecture. This is the late style of the Renaissance. It's pretty much introduced by Michelangelo. He's in a position where he can do whatever he wants to and nobody will complain about it. So he can break as many rules as he wants to and everybody will just follow him. It could also reflect a more fragmented society in Italy. When the Medici lose power in Florence, nation states go to war. Florence goes to war with Rome. Things start to turn into chaos. So the manneristic architecture, where the rules are being broken, could represent the structure of society in Italy at the time also. So a mannerist is someone who likes to break the rules, using the same vocabulary but breaking the rules. So if you like to break the rules, you're a mannerist. The great masterpiece of Mannerist architecture is the Palazzo Delta in Mantua. Mantua is north of Florence, not far from Bologna. It's the summer palace of the Gonzaga family in Mantua. The architect is Giulio Romano. Giulio Romano was the best assistant of Raphael in Florence. The Gonzaga family wanted to hire Raphael, but he didn't want to leave Rome, so he sent his best assistant, Giulio Romano. The palace is up above there. There's an extensive garden complex next to it with an exedra down at the bottom there from Roman architecture. There's a famous painting of Giulio Romano by Titian, the Venetian painter. Giulio Romano was born in Rome. He's the only important Renaissance artist or architect who was actually born in Rome. So the Palazzo Delta is named for the Lago Delta, the lake nearby. It displays tropic architecture or tropic language. It's rusticated to show that it's a strong military family, but it's also filled with humanistic references to classical Greek mythology to show that the Gonzaga family aspires to the arts and the patronage of humanism. So you have the classical Greek vocabulary, the column, the entablature, the pediment, the frieze, the architrave, all of these things used by Giulio Romano. But they're used in a pretty strange way, where he contradicts the rules of classical architecture in various places. For example, there are pieces of the architrave slipped down in each bay in the center there. The columns have been taken out from underneath the pediment over the windows, and the only part of the pediment that is left is the top edge there. So you have a piece standing in for a hole. You have pieces that sort of contradict the structural logic of the architecture. The architecture is a structural architecture. It was always used for structure in Greek architecture, but it's stripped of its structure in the Renaissance. That was done. We saw that was done by Leon Battista Alberti at the Palazzo Brunelleschi. There's another building just down the street from this by Alberti, Sant'Andrea in Mantua, where you find the same thing. The Greek architecture is stripped of its structural role. So Romano is sort of trying to, open up a secret here for us by showing that by slipping the pieces of the architrave, he's showing that this can't do anything structural anyway. It's a structural kind of architecture that's not structure, and so Alberti, wants you to think it's structural. Romano says, no, it's not structural, and I'll display that by slipping the pieces of the architrave down in each bay. So these are tropes in architecture. According to Aristotle's Rhetoric, there are 14 tropes in language. A trope is a figure of speech. It's a rhetorical, poetic, figurative speech as opposed to literal speech. The four main tropes are metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. Aristotle's Rhetoric was one of the most popular books that was required reading in the humanist education at the time. So the slipped piece of the architrave is an example of irony. The piece of the pediment above the window is an example of a synecdoche, S-Y-N-E-C-H, S-Y-N-E-C-H, D-O-C-E, I think. So a synecdoche is where a part stands in for a whole. You also have the metaphor, the comparison, the column is a tree, and the metonym, the comparison with the substitution with the part of the body. So the base of the column is a foot, the capital of the column is a head of a human body, for example. So Romano is following the rules of tropic language and creating a tropic architecture, which is a Mannerist kind of architecture that you find in the late Renaissance. There's a detail of the slipped architrave piece, and there's theater masks in the Metapiece instead of the gigantomachy like you find in the classical temple for humanism, and then the piece of the pediment floating above the window. Giulio Romano also painted the entire interior of the palace. The most famous room is this room called the Fall of the Giants. He rounds it off to create an omphalos, or a belly button, the belly button of the world. And he paints the epic battle between the gods and the giants, with the giants part of the crumbling world down below. It's an allegory for the victory of the Gonzaga, and also the victory of the Catholic Church. Looking up into the trompe-l'oeil dome, you have a radical foreshortening technique being used called di sotto in su. The material world sort of spirals down. Multiplicity comes from unity, matter comes from light, just like in a pyramid. This was inspired by the fresco called The Assumption of the Virgin by Correggio in Parma, where the Virgin is carried up into heaven, which is a blinding light, and the material world spirals down into chaos below it. These also represent the beginning of what's called apophatic theology in the Baroque, or mysticism. The idea that God can't be explained. In the Renaissance, the belief was that you could understand God if you understood mathematics and geometry and how God designed the universe, like in the Timaeus of Plato. But then at the end of the Renaissance, there was a belief that God couldn't be explained. That was a result of mysticism and the influence of Protestantism. So you see evidence of this apophatic theology, the kind of theology where God can't be put into words or explained in any way. God is just a blinding void in relation to the chaos of the material world. And the spiraling chaos of the material world becomes the core vocabulary element of the Baroque. Michelangelo's last work of architecture is the Porta Pia in Rome. There it is at the end of the Via XX Settembre on the Quirinale Hill. It's a masterpiece of Mannerist architecture. It has all kinds of puns and broken rules. The palais on the crenellation symbolize the Medici family. The dish and towel below them are a pun on the name Medici, which means doctors. In the crazy portal, you have a pediment, a round pediment inserted into a triangular pediment. Scrolls turned up on their sides looking like ears, so they're called auriculate scroll, which means ear-like. Columns with no capitals, with dentils on top of them instead. So pretty much every rule of classical architecture being broken in this crazy composition by Michelangelo, his last architectural work, an icon of Mannerist architecture and the breaking of the rules. It also kind of looks like a giant face, so it has the animistic or anthropomorphic quality that Michelangelo also always inserts into his work. So that concludes lecture theory 7 on the Renaissance. So on to the Baroque.